Okay, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Jeff Nippard podcast. In this episode, I'm speaking with Mike Israetel, Menno Henselmans, Eric Trexler, and Greg Nuckols about bulking. Now, up front, this is a very specific discussion. We're ultimately focusing this debate on one question around bulking, which is whether or not you should start your bulk at a lower body fat percentage. So if you've been following the evidence-based fitness community for the last few years, you've most likely heard that it's probably a good idea to cut and get lean first before entering a bulk phase, because when you're leaner, you're able to build lean mass more efficiently. The logic goes that leaner individuals have better partitioning ratios, also known as P ratios, meaning you're more likely to store nutrients in muscle rather than fat if you start your bulk at a lower body fat percentage. Conversely, if you begin your bulk at a higher body fat, you're more likely to partition nutrients into fat rather than muscle. And the reasoning goes that this has something to do with leaner individuals having a better hormonal milieu, whether that's better insulin sensitivity or higher testosterone or lower systemic inflammation. And I would say this has been the prevailing thought until a little earlier this year when Eric Trexler and Greg Nuckols published an in-house meta-analysis which found that lean gains don't seem to be impacted by body fat percentage like we previously thought. And I'll put the graph summarizing their main findings up here on the screen. And what you see is really the opposite of what you'd expect to see if muscle was really built most optimally at a lower body fat. In the piece, Trexler states that higher baseline body fat percentage either doesn't impact one's ability to make lean gains or actually improves one's ability to make lean gains. In other words, it seems that you can gain muscle at least as well at a higher body fat percentage as you can at a lower body fat percentage. Then, in response to this article, another science-based fitness author, Menno Henselmans, published a rebuttal, arguing that, well, he does still think that bulking at a lower body fat percentage is still a better idea for a variety of reasons that I'll let him lay out here in the debate. Now, after Menno's piece, Trexler and Nuckols published 2 more rebuttals in response, and then that brings us fully up to speed with this current debate, which will be the first time I got everyone together to fully hash this out. Now, I also pulled Dr. Mike Israetel into the discussion because I think he does a really good job of providing a practical slant to these topics. Now, before we jump into it, I want to quickly define one important term that will come up a lot. So the P ratio just stands for partitioning ratio, and it simply refers to how well you partition nutrients into muscle versus fat. So in this bulking context, we can simply take the P ratio to be the ratio of muscle gained to fat gained on your bulk. So if you have a high P ratio, that means you're gaining a lot of muscle, but not much fat. That's a good thing. And if you have a low P ratio, that means you're gaining a low amount of muscle, but a high amount of fat. That's a bad thing. So basically, a high P ratio means you're making lean gains, and a low P ratio means you're making not so lean gains. And so Trexler and Nuckols are arguing that P ratios don't seem to be impacted by body fat percentage much, and Menno is arguing that P ratios are better when you're leaner. Now, this is definitely one of the more science-heavy podcasts I've done, so if there's anything that feels out of context, I definitely recommend that you go and read those articles that I mentioned earlier. Also, it turns out that my recording software maxes out at 4 participants, so I was only able to capture video for everyone except Mike, so I still got all the audio, which is all that you really need, but unfortunately, there won't be any video parts for Mike. Also, I set this up as a formal debate where each of the 4 guests had a chance to speak on their own first, and then I sort of opened it up and asked some directed questions in the second half. Anyway, I thought this was a really clarifying discussion, and I think it's one you guys are really going to enjoy. So without further ado, I give you guys the great bulking debate. I was thinking we would start with Mike. Mike's opening statement, then we'll go to Eric for an opening statement, then we'll go to Menno, and Menno can respond to what Eric said, and if you have anything else you'd like to add, feel free, and then we'll finish with Greg responding to, I guess, what Menno and Mike said, and then we can kind of tidy anything up in the aftermath, and I've got a few questions here that I'm going to ask as well. Sound good? All right, so Mike, the floor is all yours if you want to kick it off.
All right, so here's my shtick. We got, 5 minutes or something like that? It probably won't take that long.
Yeah, whatever you think.
Yeah, an hour it is. All right, so there's a lot of really good stuff to talk about here, and there are sort of 2 conversations to be had that are quite bifurcated. One is a technical discussion on the merits of exactly the P ratio topic, and whether or not being leaner does actually potentiate more muscle gains, whether relatively or absolutely, is another interesting discussion. And then there is the grander discussion, which I think a lot of people are also interested in, which is, what should I do? Right? Okay, P ratios are interesting, but maybe they're not the entire story. What should I do with my own body fat or with my client's body fat in a few different scenarios and what is kind of the best practice given whichever way the P ratio stuff folds out. So I think there are at least 3 different scenarios that I envision as being pertinent to people who are listening to this. The first is if you yourself just started lifting weights and trying to organize your eating into something that doesn't resemble a total cluster. And or many people here are folks that help each other or help other people with their training for a fee, personal trainers, online diet coaches, so on and so forth, and they may inherit clients that are either just starting out or are maybe not just starting out, but they're in the sort of a higher body fat range, maybe in the 20 to 30 or even 30+% body fat range. And for those folks, the question is there really a very, very compelling reason, or how compelling is the reason to get significantly leaner first before even recomping or before accruing any more additional body weight? So especially recomping is a very big question here, because a lot of times you get a client that's 25 to 30% fat and they're like, oh, I want to start lifting weights. I want to become more muscular and leaner over the long term. And, there's significant psychological pressure added to the equation if you say, okay, we have to cut body fat now, and that may actually reduce long-term client success, even short-term client success. So maybe if the P ratio discussion and if the other trade-offs of being in a slightly fatter state aren't so terrible, we could potentially tell clients like that, just, hey, actually, you can just recomp for a year straight or even longer, and you can put on significant amounts of muscle. It's not a huge trade-off to be putting on muscle. On the other hand, if the debate folds out another way, and it turns out that muscular gains above 25% body fat really are much lower than they are at lower body fat ranges, then it could be a really good thing to tell clients, hey, look, for your best absolute results, I think we actually should, albeit slowly, start to get you leaner first and then worry about muscle gains in the future. So that's sort of case number 1. Case number 2 is if you have an athlete that's probably more advanced and they're in that 20 to 30 body fat range just normally through some combination of genetics, lifestyle, pharmacology, so on and so forth, and they have a question of, should I get much leaner to just have all-around better results in strength and muscle gain over the long term? So, for example, a typical strongman or some heavier classes of powerlifters just kind of live their life in the 20 to 30% body fat range. And to them, if the P ratio and all the other concerns for being leaner versus fatter for muscle gain fold out sort of one way, they would say, ooh, actually, I'm a little bit too fat to be getting my optimum results long term. Maybe I should drop from the 20 to 30% range to the 10 to 20% range and just stay there and have better results. On the other hand, if the debate turns out a different way, or if the reality turns out a different way, and a P ratio stuff doesn't really matter all that much, or maybe not at all, then for folks like that, staying between 20 and 30% and cycling there, mind you, if their health and athleticism allows it, maybe is a good idea. So that's case number 2. And then case number 3 is for folks that are interested in physique sport and or being particularly lean and muscular in combination. What is the highest body fat they should accrue during a muscle gain phase, after which it's not a good idea to go any further, right? So there's 3 potentially very different answers there, even no matter which way the P ratio stuff folds out. So really quickly, as far as I can see it, considerations for upsides of higher body fat bulks and downsides of higher body fat bulks are as follows. So upsides of higher body fat bulks is you probably, at least within a certain range, get more anabolic hormone levels. If you are fatter, this includes more estrogen, which is actually synergistically anabolic by itself within a certain spectrum of ranges. So if your estrogen is always particularly pretty low because you're trying to stay really lean, that might actually be a downside. So there's an upside there, potentially getting a little bit fatter. I think this is especially true if you're in that 7 to 10% body fat range. Going above that is almost certainly more anabolic hormonally for overall hormones for a natural athlete. Second, for the variety of mechanisms that aren't just hormonal, even at the cellular level, if you're not overly lean, there's not as much what I would call nutrient conservation pressure on a variety of those chemical pathways. When you're very lean, your body just kind of freaks out and is not so interested in adding muscle for a variety of reasons. When you're less lean, up to a point at least, even at the cellular level, there's more resources freed up to potentially grow muscle. Next one is there something that a lot of people seemingly don't consider, but is a thing, lower psychological stress or effort of diet strictness. So if you say, okay, I'm only going to stay between 10 and 15% body fat, but genetically you're a little bit fatter than that, it could take you a lot of diet control and a lot of just effort to stay that lean. And if someone like Eric and Greg, no doubt, are going to present evidence that you actually don't, there's no muscle gain harm from staying much fatter than that if you just float up and have a less restricted diet. Jeff, are you flicking me off because you're using your middle finger to wipe the crust out of your eyes. And honestly, it's fucking rude.
I forgot I only had my mic off, not the video.
Yeah. Is this what they call Canadian politeness?
That's right. Continue.
Sorry. So in any case, if you can, Greg's got one for me. There we go. It's this machine of some sort that generates middle fingers. Wow, he's got more. I just can look forward to all this middle finger nonsense. I sure hope Greg's video shows up.
I'm done now. You
Thanks.
Can keep going.
All right. I sure hope your video shows up, Greg, when this is occurring, because if it's just me talking, they're like, what the hell is wrong with Mike? Is he losing his mind? Which is also probably accurate. So in any case, if you don't have to dial down on your diet and be super strict all the time and still get the same muscular gains, it is kind of a benefit from not having, because staying lean sucks, right? It takes a huge effort. And maybe if the discussion of P ratios goes that, we can be fatter and still gain a lot of muscle, maybe that's a really big upside of not having to crush yourself all the time. Another thing is lower cardio needs. The more cardio you do past a certain point, the more interference you get, not just with lifestyle variables and stress, but also directly with muscle gain. If you have to do more and more cardio to stay leaner and leaner for ostensibly better gains, that could be a downside. So if we were allowed to mass to a higher body fat and still get great results, we could do less cardio. That could be better. And lastly, I think importantly, a disruption of gain momentum. A lot of times, and you see this a lot with folks in the real world, when they're gaining from 10% body fat, they get to 13% body fat, and they say, I really need to do a mini cut. Actually, I need to do a whole cut. So let me take 8 weeks out of this very productive mass gaining phase to do a cut. And many of you know who are listening, once you get into the groove of a mass gaining phase, a lot of times your strength starts improving. You get what I would term like a really good stimulus to fatigue ratio on your exercises. You've really worked out your leverages. You have movements that work. You're gaining momentum on them. You figure out the eating. Everything's going well. It sucks to have to disrupt that to do a cut of some sort, which oftentimes throws off your strength momentum, throws off how you feel in the gym. And then there's a bit of a sort of a restarting sort of thing. And if you guys actually want to follow someone who's doing this in real life, Greg Nuckols has been posting a lot on his Instagram lately of his efforts in the various variations of the squat, and he seems to be adding like a little bit of weight here, a little bit of a rep here, and is often referencing sort of like there's like a good momentum there, like it's going. If I have no doubt if we put Greg on a mini cut, the momentum would stall out, and then restarting momentum, especially when you're pretty big and strong, is a lot easier said than done in many cases. So we have to have a pretty compelling case for needing to do a mini cut in order to do one in many cases, and if such a case does not exist, as no doubt Eric and Greg would present, then maybe we have less of a reason to stay lean. So those are the upsides of higher fat bulks. You get all those great things. You don't have to trade off the bad ones. Downside for higher fat bulks may include the following. First of all, lower insulin sensitivity. Absolutely may be the case. There's some good reason to think that muscle loses its insulin sensitivity faster than fat does. So after a while, if you have low insulin sensitivity in your muscular tissue, you may actually have high insulin sensitivity in your fat. So your fat gets even more prone to fat anabolism, which is bad, but muscle incrementally less so. There is an argument to be made that Menno will probably be making for systemic inflammation increasing, especially beyond 25 to 30% body fat, that may not be conducive to either health or the best muscular gains, and actually may get you in a position where you may be more at risk for injuries getting out of hand, so on and so forth. You definitely get further away from your eventual lean physique. I'm a character study in this. When I was back in my natty days, which, for in the United States, I'm still in my natty days, right? But internationally, I sure as hell am not. So, in my natty days, I massed all the way up to 30% body fat. And I was like, am I a bodybuilder yet? It turned out I was 2 years away from being a bodybuilder, and the cut all the way down really sucked. So, especially if you get fat enough, you can't even see where you're making improvements anymore because you just kind of look like a blob. And psychologically, it doesn't have any really good effects either. You tell people ostensibly you train as a bodybuilder, they laugh at you, you cry, so on and so forth. Tears may or may not be anabolic. Another one is poor health. I'm inclined to believe through a variety of blood work I've done it myself and had clients and other people do, and from looking at the sort of the meta literature on this, anytime a male exceeds 20% body fat, in many cases, any further blood work at higher body fat starts to look worse and worse. Long-term health prognoses also start to look worse and worse. So you can tell yourself that massing from 20 to 30% body fat is health neutral. I'm not inclined to believe that it likely is. So I think you are getting poor health. Maybe not acutely, but in the long term, if you're much fatter than 20% for long periods of time, and you can do something about it. So maybe the 10 to 20% rule is better there. You absolutely gained fat cells, probably permanently, when you gain above a certain body fat percentage, especially one that you're typically associated with. So that, like, the dreamer bulk, when people are like, I'm at 20%, what should I do? And people are like, fucking cookies and milk, bro, and just do a lot of 5x5, and all of a sudden you're 30% body fat, and your body physically looks different. You have more fat cells. It makes every other So it permanently fucks up your appetite regulation, at least semi-permanently. I would incline to believe permanently based on the obesity literature. It also gives you loose skin, which is, as far as I can tell, only surgically treatable, and surgery is a real bad thing because you end up storing water and stuff, and it looks weird. So I have loose skin back from my days at drug-free, 5'6", 270 pounds. I would love to have never massed that far. So I think it's important to tell people that, like, hey, even if you still get really good muscular gains from 20 to 30% fat, which I'm inclined to believe is probably the case. I don't know if they're optimal, but probably pretty good. Maybe you don't want to go there because you'll end up like permanent scarring from how fat you were. Again, you go to the pool, children make fun of you, you cry. And you can't hurt children legally in America, so you have no recourse then. And then you lastly have a poor work capacity, especially with higher repetition lifts and compounds. Having been 275/6 and trying to do sets of 10 in the squat, everything leads to lower back pumps and vomiting pretty soon. And one of the things that people ask, interestingly enough, when you're dieting for a bodybuilding show is, is training harder? And in a sense, yes, because you have less energy available, but in a sense, no, because when you get leaner, you are in such good shape that you are able to do high rep compounds no problem and have a 30-second breather and go at it again. If you get up to 20% body fat, there's a notable difference between the 10 and 15 range for work capacity that I think absolutely impacts training to a small extent. If you go much further north of that, 20% to 25, 25 to 30, you get into really, really serious work capacity problems that I think just degrade the quality of your lifting and are problematic in that case. Hey, I said problematic. I hate that word. In any case, so tying all that together, and of course my analysis is based preemptively on how I think this rest of this discussion will play out, but here's my take, and then I'll just shut the fuck up for probably another hour, which is most people consider a relief when I shut up, myself included. So what I would say is, based on my sort of familiarity with evidence and all of this other stuff, I would say for new clients and folks that are just in the 20 to 30% range, you inherit as a personal trainer, for example, I think those folks can get along super well with just recomp. There is no giant impetus to have them lose a lot of fat up front. So if I got a client at 25% fat and he's like, hey, like I heard this P ratio stuff, and Lyle McDonald had that one article from 1998, which is, as far as I consider, the gold standard of evidence. And should I just get down to 9% fat immediately because otherwise I just won't gain any muscle? I would say, it's probably not true. You probably get excellent gains, maybe as good of gains, maybe slightly worse, maybe slightly better between the 20 to 30% range as you would any other range. And I think that you're totally great just solidifying your training, not worrying too much about your diet, just learning the healthy habits and eating better. And then once you're in a position where you recomp for maybe a year, maybe longer, and you want to take a shot at a fat loss phase and you feel yourself psychologically apt to do it, I think you should do it. So that's my recommendation there. So recomping is totally fine. There's no crazy impetus to try to lose a bunch of fat up front. Secondly, folks choosing to stay between 20 and 30% because that's where they seem to get their best performance, and genetically that's where their body fat is, and they're not cardio limited and they're okay with the health trade-offs or their health markers, I think they can stay between 20 and 30%. I would recommend for folks that are normally between 20 and 30%, powerlifters, strongman, so on and so forth, I think at least once they should try to get between 10 and 20%. Maybe take 6 months to a year to dip down there and see how their health and performance actually works. Because you could say, look, between 20 and 30%, I'm in excellent health. My blood work's great. My performance is excellent. This is where I stay. This is where I get my best results. Why, I'm not one of these lame bodybuilders. I don't want to put on a bikini and go on stage, dance around. Why would I get leaner? Maybe that's true. It's very likely to be true. But if you get to between 10 and 15%, at some point, you may actually find that you lose almost no or no muscle at all, thus very little strength, if anything, leverage strength, and maybe not even, because your deadlift can go up when you're at a smaller, so on and so forth. And you may find that your work capacity is so amazing that as a strongman, you're actually better. And this is something we've seen with actual strongmen in real life. Mariusz Pudzianowski being sort of the quintessential extreme example, although illustrative of the concept. He just never got tired. One of the reasons is he didn't have any body fat. Right. And there's other folks in the strongman side that had higher body fats for a while. When they dropped their body fat, they actually did better. So I think it's totally fine to be in the 20, 30% range if you feel great there. But try maybe on occasion to get lower and see how you feel after, especially sort of renorming in that lower body fat range. And then lastly, for folks interested in looking the best or stepping on stage, I think 10 to 20% is best. And recutting to under 15% body fat before going back up is probably wise. So if you're like 19% fat and you ask the question of should I continue to bulk, if maximum physique is your a stage ready physique at some point, or a very good lean muscular physique is your goal, I would say when you're above 15% fat, and sort of lost some momentum. Should you keep going? No, I think you should recut to at least below 15% fat. And I think truly competitive athletes that are in the thick of things, not long-term, but competition within the next year or two, for males, I don't think males should exceed much over 15% body fat, because the road back to below that is oftentimes much longer and more fatiguing. And if you never get below that, that would be great. So what ends up happening is you mass up from roughly 10 to roughly 15 to 17% fat. You do a mini cut to get to 13 or 14, maybe do that again. And then once you're there a couple of times and you're sort of stalled out, what you would do is take a real cut, maybe 8 to 12 weeks or something, get back down to around 10%, and then start that process over again. Because anything much north of that, if you were to cut again from it, would take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and potentially leave you in a pretty fatigued state before you actually have to do your show prep diet, which starts at roughly 10% and then goes below into the 3 to 5% range. So that's my that's pretty much almost all I have to say on the matter.
Okay, okay, first, when we're giving these figures for body fat percentages, what would women do to make that conversion? Add 8%, 10%?
I'm entirely uninterested in women, period. I think, so 5 to 7% is the figure.
Anyone can unmute.
I just want to quickly put a motion to cancel Mike.
If I've been hashtag canceled, I'm not interested. Cancellation doesn't scare me, but hashtag cancellation really, really freaks me out.
If everyone wants to unmute quickly. Yeah, any suggestions for that? Like when we're throwing around
5%.
These figures, we'll probably, say 10% to 20%, 20 to 30, whatever. Just add 8%.
Plus 9.8.
Yeah, tack like 8 to 10% on for women.
Okay.
No, 9.8. Right, it's 9.8. That actually comes from a study where they do the conversion. But of course, it's one study, so it can be 10% is a really good rule of thumb. 8 to 10.
Okay.
It's probably not linear across body fat ranges, so 8 to 10.
Okay, cool. So Mike, just one quick follow-up question, and then we'll go to Eric. In trying to, I guess, pin down your position on like the theoretical framework, I think the question we want to answer is, do P ratios go down as one accrues body fat percentage? Or in other words, do you tend to gain more fat compared to muscle as you get more fat? Where do you stand? Because some of your position kind of it's obviously a very practical stance that you laid out. Some of it kind of sounds like P ratios probably don't matter that much when you get to the 20 to 30% range. So is your stance that P ratio isn't correlated to body fat, or it is negatively correlated to body fat?
Yeah, I actually don't think we have the literature to answer that specific question you're actually asking. If we're asking the question of do fatter people gain, do they have better or worse lean ratios than leaner people, I think we have a preponderance of evidence to say that that's not the case, that their P ratios are probably about the same. But that asks a very different question than, if I'm in a position of currently being lean, will I still get really great P ratios if I accrue fat over the long term? That's actually a very different question, because we're comparing two different people in the first and the same person to their own data in the second. And I have not seen any convincing data in that second case to demonstrate that. I have seen a whole lot of talk in the bodybuilding circles from a practical perspective that asks, once you gain past a certain level of fat, things don't work all that well anymore. I certainly have found that to be the case in my own experience, but I also have a very limited view of how much my own experience should be informing such discussions. So I don't know if we have any robust evidence to conclude that, as I gain fat, does my P ratio worsen? I don't think there's much good evidence either way. There is, so for example, if you look at fatter people in the 20 to 30% body fat range, they don't seem to gain muscle any more poorly than people in the 10 to 20% range. The real question many people want to know, and that's a fine question for the person who starts at 20, 30% fat, and should they recomp? And the answer is probably yes, because seemingly they gain muscle just fine. The real question is, if you start at roughly 10%, is it better to end at 20 and go back down and then start again? Or is it better to just go all the way to 30? Right, as far as P ratios are concerned. And I've never seen a single study try to address that. It would be very difficult to do, and it's a bit of a different question in its own right. From my analysis of, at least thinking about all of the stuff together, my best guess is that you get very good P ratios between 10 and 20% body fat for males, for example, and then you probably get very decent P ratios all the way up to the 25 to 30% range. I think in practical terms, but in practical terms, a lot of other problems occur past 20% that I've sort of discussed earlier. And then I think if you get much more north of 25 to 30%, especially 30, 35, 40, so on and so forth, I think a lot of the work capacity stuff, the inflammatory stuff, some hormonal stuff, potentially insulin stuff, probably starts to get in the way. And I think people that are gaining from, say, 30 to 40% would actually be better off with more absolute muscle gains if they went down to at least 20 to 30% and maybe even lower. So that's my position.
So on an inter-individual level where you can just ping any person out and say, okay, what's your body fat percentage? You're, I guess, ambivalent as to whether or not that person would have a better or worse P ratio than someone who is leaner. But if you were to take that individual and say they were any given body fat percentage, then you think that the P ratio gets worse as they bulk, but it's probably pretty deep into that bulk. It's probably more in the like 20 to 30 plus range as opposed to the 10 to 20 range.
I think it does sound right. I can expand that view a little bit more. I think between contest leans, let's say 3% and to 10%, the P ratio gets incrementally better the more you bulk. I think from 10% to 15%, it may continue to get a little bit better or stay roughly the same. I think it stays roughly the same between 15 and 20%, and probably pretty close to the same between 20 and 25. I'd be inclined, my best hypothesis is between 25 and 30, you may be seeing a slight decline. Maybe not something that shows up in statistics, but something that maybe is practically relevant in the long term. And I think anything north of 30%, the decline would be small but measurable. So I think it actually would gain more muscle if you recut back to 20% and went 20 to 30 instead of going 30 to 40. That's my best guess, based mostly on inference from inflammation and hormone levels and so on and so forth. So I think that's definitely where I would put my best guesses at the time. But I think it's also a bit of an interesting point because I think north of 30%, especially for males, so many practical considerations start to impinge on your probability of going heavier that I think the P ratio stuff is essentially a moot point at that point.
Okay. So basically, P ratio not so good, so you tend to gain more fat than muscle when very, very lean, like contest lean. Then there's some kind of sweet spot for you. It's a pretty broad range, but probably somewhere between, let's say, 10 and 25%, where you can gain muscle more or less just as well, even within the one individual. And then past that, you start to see the P ratio start to taper off again. So you kind of do have this inverted U, but it's more skewed towards the top end where that U starts to inflect back down.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much it tapers off towards the end. I just wouldn't be confident in saying to someone that I don't think it tapers off at all.
Right.
So north of 25%, I wouldn't say, you'll be totally fine and you'll gain just as much muscle. I say, there may be a chance that you're not gaining as much because of inflammation and because of work capacity, so on and so forth. And I think maybe you're better off, going down to a slightly lower body fat percentage. I wouldn't be overly surprised if P ratios stayed quite robust into the much higher body fat percentages, but it wouldn't be my first guess.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. All right, I'll let Eric have his say on that note.
Absolutely. And I just want to mention, last night I was like, man, my opening statement, it's going to be about 7 minutes, and Jeff said we have 5. So I spent a lot of time cutting that down, Mike. No, I'm kidding.
How long was mine? It was like 20 minutes or 30 minutes?
I think you were at 8 minutes. Oh, I'm kidding, like 25.
I was going for 9.8 minutes, but I failed.
Yeah.
All right.
So
let's hear it.
I really appreciate the practical perspective that Mike shared. And with my opening statement, I want to focus more, before we talk about when we should leverage this relationship between body fat and P ratio, or how we can leverage it, or if we should leverage this potential relationship between body fat and P ratio, I want to focus more on the evidence of, can we leverage it? Like, do we have sufficient evidence to really say that within a particular body fat range, P ratios are going to be better or worse? So Greg and I, we've written about it recently in a few articles, and we think there's insufficient evidence to suggest that high body fat impairs P ratios or impairs hypertrophy in otherwise healthy folks who are lifting weights regularly. And it's important to recognize that we're not defending a long-standing belief here. And in fact, Greg has written in the past things that are actually pretty compatible with this idea that high body fat impairs P ratios. But a couple months ago, we kind of committed to starting with a blank slate, and we just wanted to set out to find all the evidence and to weigh it thoughtfully. And when we did that, we were really surprised by the lack of evidence supporting this concept, and we came to find it very hard to reinforce this concept that high body fats impair hypertrophy or impair P ratios. So with our approach, it was really guided by a few overarching scientific principles. We really wanted to emphasize validity, generalizability, and the hierarchy of evidence. And so we specifically sought out to find longitudinal human interventions. We sought out to find studies that actually measured the variables we're interested in, so body fat and hypertrophy. And we wanted to find studies that used young, healthy subjects that were actually lifting weights throughout the study. And we felt that type of evidence, that body of evidence, would give us the most relevant, reliable, and the most robust evidence to actually address this question. And we took a very empirical approach. So rather than focusing on mechanisms, we focused more on observed outcomes. Because, we believe that if this relationship exists between body fat and P ratios, if it exists and it matters, we should be able to get glimpses of that in the literature. With all the research that's been done on hypertrophy, we should be able to find clues of it at the bare minimum. So we wanted to focus on outcomes in the most relevant data we could find. So we got data from 7 studies. These were done in relevant populations using relevant measurements. So baseline body fat, hypertrophy over the course of a standardized resistance training program. And we got that data together, pooled it together, and we did a number of analyses. I mean, we did a ton of different analyses to try different perspectives to see if we could get a glimpse of this relationship. And we really could not find any evidence that would really support the idea that high body fats were impairing hypertrophy or impairing one's ability to make lean gains. And it's really important to emphasize that we're not arguing for any particularly strong perspective here. We're just arguing for the null hypothesis, basically. In science, we generally tend to assume that the null hypothesis is true until we've been convincingly, essentially talked out of it. And so Greg and I think hypertrophy outcomes are pretty well explained by pretty basic stuff. A person's training and nutrition variables, their genetics, their training status. We think that gives us a lot of information about how likely a person is to achieve hypertrophy. And if you want to add additional complicating factors like what is their current body fat or what is their current body fat relevant to their previous body fat, you really have to demonstrate why that additional complication is actually necessary to make an informed projection of one's potential to achieve hypertrophy. So we feel that in this particular conversation, the burden of proof really isn't on us. We're just saying there's this kind of common belief that this stuff matters, and we're not seeing the evidence for it at this time. And so to put it like a really tangible metaphor in place, you could imagine a new flashy supplement hits the market, and just like any other supplement, it's going to be marketed based on a logical claim. We know that this is important based on rodent research, therefore you should take this supplement. And logically, it'll make sense. But it's going to be based on evidence that's low in the hierarchy of evidence, right? Like we've got this rodent data saying this chemical is important, therefore take this supplement when you lift. So if we carry that metaphor forward and we say, okay, then researchers do 7 studies to actually test, does this supplement improve hypertrophy? And 6 of those studies say, no, it has no effect at all. And the 7th study says, actually, this impaired hypertrophy or, performance or whatever outcome we're looking at. We've got 6 studies showing no effect and 1 study showing an actually unfavorable effect. And then somebody takes all 7 of those studies and pulls them together and does a meta-analysis and says, yeah, there's no effect of the supplement. It's really difficult to continue saying, well, let's go ahead and assume that the supplement works and then base our practical recommendations based on that. And that's kind of where we find ourselves with the P ratio stuff. We found these 7 studies. 6 showed no effect on the ability to make lean gains with body fat. The other actually showed the higher your body fat is at baseline, the better chance you're going to make leaner gains, but it was mostly just because they were recomping and losing fat. But we really don't have a lot of evidence to say, people who start with a lower body fat percentage are better off when they endeavor to achieve hypertrophy through resistance training. So we've got a series of issues with the general ideas that have been put out related to P ratios and body fat. And so the first one is that the argument is largely based on data from studies that are low on the hierarchy of evidence, which tend to be a little bit less generalizable and robust. And the actual studies have generalizability issues. It's a lot of stuff with rodents who are regenerating muscle because it got frozen or because a toxin was injected. It's elderly people who have inflammation unrelated to body fat, that is aging related. It's cross-sectional studies in people who are not lifting and are recovering from anorexia nervosa, or they're recovering from a really severe starvation diet. So we have issues with some of the data that's feeding this line of this kind of logical argument. But looking at the logical argument, even the structure of it is a little bit weak, because, you know, we've got maybe a weak relationship between body fat and inflammation, and then another weak relationship between inflammation and hypertrophy. And in some cases, that's being used to suggest a strong relationship going all the way from body fat to hypertrophy or P ratios. And we don't think that that's a sound argument in terms of its structure. The argument also tends to be totally unquantified. You know, you'll have people say you need to keep body fat low to prevent inflammation, to prevent impairment of hypertrophy, but few people can give an evidence-based recommendation of how low should body fat be to result in a given range of inflammation levels. So those things could be quantified, but we haven't seen a fully quantified argument along those lines. The argument also fails to account for the fact that just about any mechanism that you could use to link high body fat to impaired hypertrophy or impaired P ratios is going to be attenuated to some degree by just being more active and getting on a resistance training program and getting some of those early adaptations to resistance training. And then finally, probably our biggest issue with the hypothesis or the argument is that it simply lacks empirical support. You know, getting back to our initial perspective, which is if this exists and matters, we feel like we should be able to observe that in a variety of different areas of the literature. And we're just not seeing those empirical observations actually panning out to support the logical kind of mechanistic theory that's been put forward. So with all those things considered, Greg and I still feel like there's insufficient evidence to really say that someone actually can leverage their P ratio in a way that leverage their body fat to impact their P ratio in a meaningful way to facilitate hypertrophy. But that's with a couple caveats. So first of all, we think it's very possible that this stuff could matter outside the ranges of age and body fat that we looked at in our big analysis of those seven studies. So we looked at males up to 38% body fat. We looked at females up to 53% body fat. We cannot logically discount the possibility that when you go beyond that, this stuff starts to matter more. That would not be a fair interpretation of the evidence we have. Also, our studies involve people under the age of 50. So perhaps as you get older into 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, some of that age-related inflammation coupled with body fat-related inflammation, maybe there's something happening there. We don't have the evidence to discount that based on what we looked at. And finally, the second caveat is probably the most important thing in this discussion. If someone can find and present that compelling evidence, then we'll gladly change our perspective. We simply want to just see the actual outcomes being influenced by these variables that are purported to influence them.
Great. So very quickly, just to make your position clear, relevant to like the question we're trying to answer, what do you think the relationship is between P ratio and body fat percentage? Is there one? No relationship at all? Mike said he thinks it's an inverted U, but it kind of takes a while to get to that second, that point where the U starts to drop off. Do you think there's no relationship at all, or what's your best guess at it?
Well, I think there's certainly a relationship when we get at the very low extremes of body fat. It can be quite difficult to achieve meaningful hypertrophy in the absence of fat gain when you're very, very lean. And I think there's really sound evidence to suggest that that's the case. So in my opinion, we look at all the physiological ramifications of getting shredded, like stage lean physique athletes, sub 8%, sub 9% body fat. I think when you're really lean into the low single digits, mid single digits, I think it is very challenging to have a favorable P ratio. But once we get out of that range, we're just not seeing evidence of that other side of the inverted U. We're seeing unfavorable stuff at very low body fats, but we're not seeing in the data that we've looked at where that starts to dip down And again, that's within the ranges we're observing. So up to 38% in males, up to 53% in females. So beyond that, who knows? We can't discount that, but we also think from a practical perspective, we don't get a lot of people who are asking us, should I go from 38% to 44% body fat for a male on this bulk? Because if someone's in that position, then they're making usually they're in a sport that rewards high body weight for its own sake. Like I've talked to defensive tackles who play American football who say, I need to be heavy so I can't get pushed around. Like this isn't a body comp thing anymore. So you start to get into very specific scenarios when you talk about intentionally bulking beyond 38% body fat for a male or 53% for a female. So I think, we're not seeing that downward part of the U. So I would say if you're really, really shredded, it's going to be tough to make lean gains. And actually, our data supported that. I pointed out in our first article, we didn't see a lot of people making lean gains under about 8% body fat, which is not like the primary aim of our analysis, but we plotted it and we're like, oh, look at that. Makes sense. So it was nice to see that our data were valid enough to kind of reaffirm that suspicion. But yeah, so in terms of the higher body fats, it's possible beyond the ranges we've seen, but I'm pretty at this point until I see more evidence. I'd say up to those specific ranges I mentioned, we're not seeing that body fat level where P ratios start to tank. And one thing I would like to add on to that is, Mike talked about comparing individuals versus comparing within an individual. And that is a good distinction. It's an important distinction. Unfortunately, I don't think we're really ever going to have the randomized controlled trial to really look at that. Not to be too pessimistic, but that's a hell of a study design to put together. But I will say we do have data on weight rebounds and weight regain following weight loss that have looked at P ratios. And granted, this is in people who aren't lifting weights, but we often see that when someone loses weight and then regains it in the scientific literature, not talking anecdotes here, the P ratio tends to be either maintained or slightly worse during the subsequent weight regain phase. So I can't say that I have really strong data on that in lifters, but I can say we've got really strong non-longitudinal cross sections in lifters who are doing hypertrophy programs. And the data available in non-lifters would cause us to think that P ratios either don't change or get a little bit worse during weight regain. And that's looking at people at a variety of different body fat levels. It's not just super lean people.
All right. On that note, Menno, you can go ahead.
All right. Let me start by saying sort of what my position is. I'd summarize it as given the lack of evidence on direct data on strength trainees relating body fat percentage to P ratios or even muscle growth or anything, we have to rely on other lines of research. And if we look at other lines of research, I think there is enough cause for concern not to recommend someone to bulk up to levels that what constitute being overweight, unless they have a very specific reason to. And probably at very low body fat levels, the P ratio would also start to deteriorate. I wouldn't say I'm very dead set on that being true, because the thing with refeeding studies is that the most likely cause, both in competitors and in like the loose studies that look at refeeding, they have an excess energy surplus. They eat too much because they're very lean. They have a huge appetite, and if you have a huge energy surplus, we have convincing data also in strength trainees that most of that will contribute to fat gain. There is basically a certain level of there is basically a level of muscle growth that you can realize, and once you've realized that, overfeeding more is mainly just going to add fat. Like it can be discussed that the ratio gets worse, but in research, based on the research we have, we see that it's almost binary. Now, I think it's not completely, but it almost seems like it's just this is what you're going to get, and anything beyond this in terms of energy surplus is pretty much going to be fat. So the lines of research basically are that we have the Forbes study, which shows that or the Forbes and Hall research, which shows that in people that don't lift, it does seem that if you overfeed them, they gain a better ratio of muscle to fat at lower body fat levels. But it goes both ways. So, can we change that relation with strength training? We don't know. But at least it shows, empirically speaking, there is something there. Like there is some relation, probably in some regard. Maybe it's just a muscle mass settling point or something, but there is something there. It's not like it comes completely out of the blue. Someone says like body fat percentage relates to muscle growth, and you're like, how? Like, why? This makes no sense. Then we have the rodent study, which is, it's a rodent study. But I'd say it's somewhat proof of principle that bulking up to an excessively high body fat percentage, or specifically in this study, bulking up to the point where you get insulin resistance, interferes with muscle growth. Now, the counter argument that Trexler presented, Eric presented, is that they are at almost the same body fat level, but they did gain it. They gained more fat in the study period before. It could also be that it's more due to diet composition than body fat percentage per se. And I think it is good to remark that body fat percentage is not the real culprit. Like, it's the associated health effects or metabolic derangements that come with being at a certain body fat percentage. So the only reason why in practice I think it still makes sense to discuss body fat percentage is because when you have a client, you don't know if they have systemic inflammation. Sure, you can do blood work. There are some biomarkers that might make sense. Eric commented on that in our previous debate on this. But in practice, you really don't know. You don't even know someone's real body fat percentage. So there's also quite some error there. So in practice, the recommendation I would give is simply, well, because we don't know all these things, it's probably best to avoid that upper end range where body fat percentage starts negatively correlating with these factors that in turn might contribute to poor muscle growth. And those factors are worse anabolic hormone levels. We know that especially in men, testosterone levels decrease, and sometimes substantially, sometimes not so substantially, as you get to the overweight, obesity range, to the point that some people actually get full-blown hypogonadism. So, overall, does that really matter if your testosterone goes down like 10%? Well, for those individuals, probably not so much. I've had some clients that actually had low testosterone when they were sub 15%, and they basically needed to be 15% to have normal levels. So there are some exceptions to the rule that generally as you get fatter, your testosterone starts to decrease. Then there's inflammation, and the literature on this is definitely weak. If you look at like lean, young strength trainees, there's almost none. So it's mostly elderly individuals, obese individuals. But it's enough to say that, at a certain level of inflammation, it's probably going to be bad for muscle growth. And we also have substantial literature showing that if you gain body fat, it typically increases your inflammation levels. So we can say that, well, we don't know where, but at a certain point, probably this starts becoming detrimental. And I say especially because we don't know, it pays off to be, more conservative. There's recovery capacity, not directly related to P ratios, but it is another, more of the practical side that we have good research showing that at least in previously untrained individuals, it takes them longer to recover from a workout when they're overweight compared to when they're lean. Or rather, it's across individuals, it's not within individuals. So obese individuals typically recover less fast and suffer more neuromuscular fatigue and indices of muscle damage after a given workout than lean individuals. Which in turn, if you're pushing up the volume, may over time start manifesting as a difference in muscle growth. And then, possibly most important of all, we have literature on protein balance, which shows that obese individuals, compared to lean individuals, tend to have anabolic resistance to food, meaning that if you give them protein, they typically don't get as much protein synthesis after a meal. It's not super consistent, but the overall trend, I'd say, is decidedly negative. And if you look at trained individuals, we only have two studies, one's negative, one's neutral. But to aggregate that all together, in my view, that constitutes a negative trend in favor of staying lean for protein balance. And protein balance is, very tightly linked to muscle growth, at least on a theoretical level. And I think there is also sufficient empirical support at this time that the long-term aggregated, accumulated, sort of the area under the curve of myofibrillar muscle protein synthesis correlates well with long-term other measures of muscle growth. So we have these considerations, which I say, well, probably best not to go into the ranges where those considerations might actually become problematic, Mike. So then we have the meta-analysis, which I thought was really cool, a really good idea by Eric and Greg, to actually look at this empirically in trained individuals. Now, I think Eric's analogy to the supplement is a bit misleading here because it portrays it as if those studies are on this topic, but they're not. They're on a different topic. So most of those studies are on, well, there are 7 studies, so they're all on different things. But let's say one's on training volume, then you have 2 groups of people, one's on higher volume, one's on lower volume. Now you can control for this. But really basically what you're doing in a meta-analysis like this, like very simple version for people at home, is you have a lot of, you're trying to make a graph with body fat percentage and muscle growth. And there were a lot of dots of data points, like certain individuals at a certain level of body fat, and this is the amount of muscle growth they had in the study. Now, you cannot just lump all of these data together because of these different studies. They all look at different things. So what you have to do is you do it within study. Not only that, but you also sort of have to do it within category, within the group of study. So basically what you're doing, you have these 7 studies, which sounds like a lot. But you have 7 studies of about 20 people. I think the largest amount of sample was 38 or something. Most of them are like 8 weeks. So it's like 7 studies, 20 people per group, typically 8-week studies. I think some were a bit longer. One was like 6 weeks only. So you're trying to draw a graph between like those 20 people, but it's within groups. So it's like you're drawing the line on only 10 data points. And then you still have to factor in that in those studies, typically diet was not controlled. Sometimes training was not controlled, depending on which study you look at. So you have 10 data points, pretty much, and the amount of confounders is huge, right? Absolutely huge. Because if you look at just the muscle response within a given study, how much muscle growth did they get? It's a complete fan shape. Like some people manage to lose muscle mass. Like, don't ask me how, but you put some people that are not even trained sometimes in a study, they lose muscle mass. Like it's shocking, but it's quite common. So you have this massive fan shape already, just because of presumably genetic factors, lifestyle factors, sleep, stress. And then the biggest confounder of all, energy balance. So again, you can control for this somewhat, but it's still a linear control for a linear variable. And once you get to the point where you have, you're drawing these lines through like 10 data points, and we can probably name 10 confounders, then you can talk to any epidemiologist. It doesn't work anymore. Look at the literature on red meat, on vegetarians versus regular individuals. There are so many confounders that basically you get sometimes no effects where there is actually a consistent effect in randomized controlled trials, and B, sometimes you find effects that really aren't there, and they are very significant. So overall, I think when you look at these studies, you really can't make much out of it. So it's just because the data is not there, and we try to do with what we have, but it's just not enough. So I think looking at this data, we just can't make much out of it. And funny enough, actually, the only study where there was a significant effect of body fat percentage on the P ratio or lean gains metric, which they used, Schoenfeld et al. It's also a good illustration. It's not an overfeeding study, and you're looking at the argument that as you get progressively fatter, muscle growth or the P ratio starts deteriorating, but most of these studies are not overfeeding studies to begin with. They have a lot of subjects in deficit, some are in energy surplus. Funny enough, the Schoenfeld study was supposed to be a bulking study, but there was net fat loss in the study, which goes to show exactly what a massive confounder diet adherence is. And there, at higher body fat levels, the P ratio or lean gains metric was better. Well, that's actually an argument, I'd say, in favor of not, it's an argument in favor of cutting when you're at high body fat levels, because it shows that at higher body fat levels, nutrient partitioning is better. Maybe because fat loss is relatively easier, rather than muscle growth being relatively harder to come by, but you could actually construe that evidence in favor of the model. So I think this meta-analysis overall is just, we're trying to look at data that we simply don't have. Now, what I would like to see, I can also give you a study design that I would like to see. And if we have 7 of those studies, I will completely withdraw all of these concerns I have. You look at untrained individuals, obese versus lean, on a given program in energy surplus. That's crucial because we're looking at muscle growth during a bulk, so there should be an energy surplus. All of them controlled. Previously untrained individuals. Otherwise, there's another big factor, training status. Some people are more trained, closer to their natty max than others. Some people have a natty max, Mike. And when you get close to that, things become harder. We have to work harder. So, that's another factor that in a study is really hard to control, because how do you quantify like how advanced someone is? So probably you'd have to do this study on untrained individuals and then do it for probably quite a long period, because this is not going to be a huge effect, probably. I think we all agree that training, nutrition variables, sleep, probably also stress level, certainly genetics are much bigger factors than your body fat percentage, especially when we don't know if your body fat percentage is contributing to insulin resistance or chronic inflammation or whatever other adverse metabolic effects it has. And we're just looking at body fat percentage as a proxy for those things. So if we don't know all these things, my overall stance is best to err on the side of safety, stick to the range where what we consider non-overweight, which for men is typically, I agree with Mike, 21% would be the cutoff. And maybe err on the side of being even leaner, because my perspective on this is heavily influenced by my job as a physique coach, and probably 90% of my clients are interested in fat loss. So my argument is more, if you don't have a compelling reason to go higher, just stay lower. Like, it's aesthetically more appealing, considered by most people, of course, personal preference. There's just not much reason, I'd say, to go heavier. And there are potential, at least theoretical considerations with bulking up higher. So my sense is, why risk it?
Mm-hmm. That's great. So Menno, it seems like you think that P ratios are probably similar up until you get to about 20%-ish, and then they start to drop off. I'm just trying to pin down whereabouts you think bulking further would actually not be a good idea, because you're really going to start to gain a lot more fat than muscle, and it might be a better idea to then cut down to make better lean gains.
Yeah, I have a really hard time putting exact numbers on it. But if you look at, for example, the Forbes stuff for hormonal health, it could actually be quite low. And I think it's more to the point that, between 10 and 15%, you're looking at a tiny, tiny effect. And then once you start looking at over 20%, we start looking at an effect that might actually become statistically significant in a well-designed study on this topic. Mm-hmm. I think before we get to the point, if we do the study I just talked about, and it's between 10 and 15%, that's within the measurement error range of the DEXA scan. So Are you going to find a statistically significant result there? I highly doubt it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then what if, quickly, I'll move on to Greg, but what if this idea that because I think this is one of the most practically relevant questions, is you can or should cut before bulking. So say someone comes to you who might be on that upper end of the range, 18% body fat, their primary goal is to build muscle. They're not gung-ho about gaining fat, but building muscle is their main goal. Do you think that it would actually potentiate lean gains for them to get down more in, let's say, the 10 to 12 zone first?
It might, and to the extent that if they have any desire of getting below that 18% level, like long term, my approach is pretty much always cut first, because it might be beneficial this way compared to the reverse order, and we want to get leaner anyway. You'll look better, probably you'll feel better. So again, the reason is, why risk it?
Got it. Okay. So Greg, you can go ahead. Thanks for being so patient, man.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm batting clean up here. There's a lot of stuff to respond to. I think just to start with, to start by responding to Mike, I actually don't know that I disagree with virtually anything he said. I think that there's I think that there are two separate questions here, as have been delineated pretty well. The first is, practically, if someone comes to you and they're at a given level of body fat and they have certain goals, they want to get big, they want to get strong, they maybe want to get lean at some point, what sort of advice do you give them? And that seems to be the question Mike primarily focused on. And I actually don't think I disagree with any of his recommendations practically. Or if I do, they're relatively small quibbles. The second question is, I think, like the actual question at hand. If you're giving someone advice based on their level of body fat, should the impact of their current level of body fat on their P ratio factor into that discussion? So basically, do we have good evidence that maybe someone at higher body fat levels should cut because of their P ratio, not necessarily because of other factors? On that topic, I don't think the evidence is compelling. So I think Eric did a really good job laying out our perspective already. Basically, if we assume the null, if we assume that there's not good evidence that different levels of body fat have a major impact on P ratio, we need to see compelling evidence to adequately disprove the null, to move away from the null. And I simply don't think that evidence exists. So I think that most of my response here will probably be primarily responding to Menno. So first, Menno brought up the Forbes and Hall data showing, Jeff, I assume that you can put images up on the screen for people watching on YouTube, or at least link stuff in the show notes.
Yeah.
The Forbes and Hall data does demonstrate that in overfeeding studies on people with substantially differing levels of body fat, P ratios are considerably higher in very lean people than people who have quite a bit more body fat. The drawback to that data when it comes to generalizing to strength athletes or lifters of any stripe really is one, those people weren't lifting. So that's a major confounder. Another issue is a lot of those folks were recovering from anorexia, as Eric mentioned. And I think the issue there is when we think P ratios, when you're thinking P ratios in the concept of powerlifting, bodybuilding, physique, sports, whatever, you're thinking about the ratio of fat you gain versus the ratio of muscle you gain. When you're actually assessing P ratios, it's just lean mass as a percentage of total mass. And lean mass includes muscle, but it also includes a lot of other things. In those studies on anorexic people, we don't actually know the degree to which the lean mass they gained contributing to that really high P ratio was regaining skeletal muscle mass versus the degree to which it was, regaining organ mass or any of the other, composites of lean mass that are lost during the process of anorexia. So Eric and I don't think that that's particularly informative data for our purposes here. Menno brought up the rodent study. I'm not even going to touch that because I don't give a shit. The rodent study itself, Eric wrote about it for mass just as a framing device to talk about P ratios in the first place. We don't care about it. So I don't think that's really worth talking about more. So Menno said something next that I thought was very interesting and that I think somewhat agree with. Basically that body fat percentage isn't necessarily the real culprit. It is the impact that body fat percentage can have on things like insulin sensitivity, inflammation, etc. So I think that one, from a practical perspective, that makes a lot of sense. So, some people are just lifting to get huge, get strong, get big and have a big coffin, but most people who are working out are at least theoretically interested in health. And we do know that higher levels of body fat are associated with a lot of generally deleterious health effects. And so from a practical perspective, if you're using body fat as a proxy for maybe negative health outcomes, I think that does make some sense. And it is theoretically possible that at sufficiently high levels of inflammation, sufficiently low levels of insulin sensitivity, that those things, sufficiently low levels of testosterone associated with higher body fats, that those things could have a negative impact on hypertrophy. That is certainly possible. I think the issue that Eric and I have is with using body fat necessarily as a proxy measure and then giving recommendations based on specific body fat ranges. So, it is entirely possible that I don't know units on IL-6, but, let's say if IL-6 gets up to 10 of the standard units, that's too high and that starts negatively impacting muscle growth. That's very possible. And for a certain individual, maybe their IL-6 starts creeping up that high if they're at 20% body fat. For someone else, it might be 35. And there is certainly a relationship. There is an association between body fat and all of these various health markers, but it's not a particularly strong relationship. both within individuals and within populations. That relationships certainly exist, but you can't, or at least I haven't seen evidence saying that, if you clear 20% body fat, there's an 80% chance that your insulin sensitivity will be too low, and there's a 90% chance that your inflammation levels will be too high. Nor has it even been quantified how low your insulin sensitivity needs to get or how high your inflammation needs to get to start having deleterious effects. So these are quantifiable relationships that we simply haven't seen quantified. One of the things I mentioned on Facebook when responding to some comments about mine and Eric's most recent article is that I think it's entirely possible that Menno's general argument is correct, that as body fat levels get too high, a bunch of negative things can result from that, and that can negatively impact muscle growth. However, we do have data that I think is pretty good up to relatively high body fat levels, suggesting that that isn't the case. I think it's entirely possible, and Mike alluded to this, that if males are getting over, say, 40, 45, 50% body fat, you might start seeing like pretty large deleterious effects on hypertrophy. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying we don't have data to suggest that, but I think that's something that is entirely plausible. So it could be that the general argument is correct, but the actual specific ranges being suggested are wrong, that we really don't have evidence that getting over 15% is bad or getting over 20% is bad. If that evidence exists, I haven't seen it. Let's see, the protein balance stuff, I think Eric will probably be the one who wants to take a swing at that. I think the last thing that I want to address, because I feel like I'm probably pushing 5 minutes at this point, is Menno's, I wouldn't say characterization, but basically how he's weighting the meta-analysis that Eric and I performed. I think that his critiques of it are fair for the most part. So basically the studies that went into the meta-analysis, they were general training studies that had people with different levels of body fat that experienced different levels of hypertrophy. And using linear mixed models, Eric wanted to see basically, is body fat percentage pre-training a significant predictive variable for various hypertrophy outcomes? And we were unable to find that in males, females, people with all sorts of body fat levels, except there was a positive there was a positive relationship between body fat and our lean gains metric that was driven by the fact that people with higher body fat levels had an easier time losing fat, basically. But for direct measures of hypertrophy, didn't seem to be much of a relationship. And Menno is correct that an ideal study design would have, instead of just looking at various training variables, specifically looking at the impact of body fat. So in fact, I would improve on Menno's suggested design by having a body fat manipulation pre-training. So you have some people intentionally lose body fat or body weight before the training intervention starts, and some people intentionally gain before they start, and then see if that has much of an impact. But the thing is, that's not a feasible study to do. I don't think it's ever going to get funded. I don't think it's ever going to get done. It would be a pain in the ass to control in the real world. And so basically, the meta-analysis we performed doesn't include the theoretical perfect studies to answer the question. But I think basically it's the best evidence we have. Essentially, if you're trying to make an informed decision about whether higher levels of body fat inhibit your ability to gain muscle, are you going to look at people who are generally healthy, young, engaging in resistance training, directly measuring, do people with higher levels of body fat have issues gaining muscle? Or are you going to look at, studies on inflammation in elderly folks who don't have different levels of body fat, but who do have different levels of inflammation, and try to make inferences from that? Basically we do have direct evidence presented in our meta that isn't the best conceivable evidence, but is pretty good, and does either directly or very strongly indirectly address the question at hand, versus a smattering of mechanisms with unquantified relationships between the mechanisms themselves and body fat and the mechanisms themselves and hypertrophy. So basically, which one of those cases seems stronger to you? I know which direction I lean. And basically, do I think that the mechanistic stuff on inflammation or purportedly anabolic hormone levels, do I think that's strong enough to disprove the null hypothesis? And I don't think it is. And then, actually, I said that was the last thing. I had one more thing to add. So I think, like, ultimately, both Menno and Mike's critique is good, that there is a difference between looking at hypertrophy in people at baseline who have different levels of body fat versus within one individual over time going between different body fat levels. Those are two slightly different things. Eric brought up research showing that in research looking at people who lose body fat and regain it, P ratios tend to be about the same or slightly worse, but those studies don't include a resistance training component, which is a notable limitation. So, basically within resistance training folks, all we really have is anecdote for, what people say happens when they cut and then regain weight while training, or when they bulk and keep bulking for a long time and get to high body fat levels, and how their gains change over time. And I think that one thing to note is there might just be some perceptual biases in anecdotes like that would lead people to believe that their P ratios are better than they actually are when they're lean, and worse than they actually are when they're at higher body fat levels. So the first is that when you get pretty lean, when you gain weight, as long as you still have some definition, it's easy to assume that most of what you're gaining is muscle, just because you do notably look so much bigger in the mirror, and you do still look kind of lean. You do still have some definition. So I think that for leaner people, it's easier to trick yourself into believing that some of the fat you're gaining is in fact muscle. And then two, for the actual muscle you're gaining, since there's less fat covering it, it's going to be more visually apparent. And so it's also easier to see and note the muscle you're actually gaining. Compared to when you have more body fat, you can gain a lot of muscle and it's hard to visually see it because you have no definition. There's a fair bit of body fat covering it. And also, I think that Mike and I might agree on this. I think, and I'll admit that I don't have evidence like to directly back this up, but I think that there is some degree of time dependence going on when it comes to running bulks for a long time, where when you're basically doing hypertrophy focused training for longer and longer and longer, your general sensitivity to it can start trending down over time. And so, if you start lean, let's say you start at 10, 15%, and you go into a relatively modest calorie surplus, and a year from now, you've been doing hypertrophy focused training the whole time, and now you're 25% body fat. You very well could be gaining muscle at a substantially slower rate at that point, simply because you've been exposing yourself to the same general training stimulus for that long. And you notice that, like, hey, I'm not gaining muscle as well, and my body fat percentage is higher, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the causal variable there. So anyway, I don't necessarily think we should conclude anything solid from anecdotes. Obviously, that's not how I roll. But I do think that those are some potential perceptual biases in play when it comes to thinking about and evaluating anecdotes in this area.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think I'll open it up now. I feel like you guys kind of addressed a lot of the things I was personally curious about, having read the stuff that went into this. One thing that kept coming up in my mind was Eric and Greg, your guys' meta, basically plotted a lot of different individuals of different body fat percentages and assessed how much lean gains they made. To me, I want you to explain how that can be used to, I guess, make the stance that you can gain lean mass just as well at a lower body fat percentage as a higher body fat percentage, as the meta to me seems to mostly show that there are genetic differences in propensity to build muscle, and different people are of different body fat percentage. Not necessarily that as you get to a higher body fat percentage, it doesn't negatively impact your ability to make lean gains. So again, it comes back to intra-individual trends versus a trend within one given individual. Do you understand? Like how can you take one to support the other? Does that make sense?
So I think Trex can probably answer the technical question better than I can. But just to start with on kind of a meta level, and this relates back to something Menno said as well as a criticism of our meta-analysis, that basically, in the studies we looked at, there were a lot of confounders. So, you're obviously not controlling for individual genetics. Some people were in a surplus, some people were in a deficit, sleep wasn't controlled, nutrition wasn't controlled, etc. But people did have different body fat levels and gained different amounts of lean mass. They lost different amounts of fat, they gained different amounts of muscle, etc. And basically for the actual hypertrophy stuff, body fat didn't seem to be a notable predictor. So I think our basic position is that it is true that there are a lot of confounders which may contribute to our inability to detect a significant difference of body fat on any of these outcomes. But I'd also argue that's kind of our point, where if body fat itself was having any sort of notable independent effect, we should be able to detect it. And one thing to note is it wouldn't need to have a particularly strong effect for us to be able to detect it. So one of the things Eric did is he looked at gains in lean mass or changes in lean mass and changes in fat mass independently to see if baseline body fat percentage was significantly associated with either of those. And baseline body fat percentage was significantly negatively associated with changes in fat mass. So people with higher body fat percentage at baseline did lose more fat mass. But the slope of that relationship was like negative 0.09, which basically means that for every 10% change in body fat percentage, that would be associated with a differential change in fat mass of 1 kilogram. So that's a really small effect, and the meta-analysis was adequately powered to detect that. So if there was any notable association at all between body fat percentage and propensity to gain muscle, that should have been detectable. Like it was adequately powered to detect a small effect. And if all of those other, so-called confounders are having such a larger impact on hypertrophy than body fat is, it makes me ask of what value is bringing body fat into the equation, because it doesn't seem to be having a notable independent impact.
Yeah, like before seeing your guys' meta, just to clarify what I meant by that, I would have expected the lean gains metric to go down as body fat percentage went up. So I think it's an interesting finding that, based on that data set, body fat doesn't really seem to be inhibiting hypertrophy really in any significant way. But I think it still very much maybe leaves open the question of whether or not in any given individual increasing body fat above, say, their set zone or what have you, wouldn't actually cause their P ratio to decline. Does that make sense?
Can I just quickly comment on this?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. I think it's not just about statistical power. So it's not just noise. It's not just genetics, for example. I think in these cases, because many of the variables you're looking at, like even potential collider effects and definitely potential for multicollinearity in the analysis. So you're looking at systemic biases. And one concrete one that in what you just brought up is potentially that if you have people that are a higher body fat percentage and they typically end up losing more fat, which is probably because they were in more negative energy balance, then it makes sense that it basically biases the results in favor of the lean gains metric, right? Especially because it weighs fat loss and muscle growth equally. So it's much harder, it's much easier to lose fat. And we shouldn't even be looking at fat loss studies to begin with if we want to look at the P ratio during bulking. So in this kind of analysis, it biases the results towards in favor of higher body fat percentage individuals precisely because they end up losing fat. And, we cannot extrapolate that result, therefore, to what happens in energy surplus and really say anything about that hypothesis.
Right. So wait, Menno, one second also, on that.
Sorry, I've talked enough. You got it, Eric.
So the bias is such that people with higher baseline body fat are in more negative energy balance. That's what you're contending?
That's a possible bias, yeah.
Do you find it interesting that those people in negative energy balance made similar gains in hypertrophy, despite being in more negative energy balance?
Yes, definitely. And it would be an argument, I'd say, in favor of cutting. Like, then it would seem to suggest like you can gain a similar amount of muscle, but also lose fat, right?
So, but I mean, don't you think if being at a higher body fat has a negative impact on one's ability to achieve hypertrophy, and even beyond that, they're in more negative energy balance, and yet they're achieving the same degree of hypertrophy, don't you think that contradicts the idea that hypertrophy is being impaired at these higher body fat percentages?
In energy surplus. So it's plausible that it would not matter during energy deficit, although I'd say it's definitely an interesting finding. But it's possible that many of these mechanisms in energy deficit, just like strength training, energy deficit ameliorates many of these metabolic health effects. So it could be the case that, well, in energy deficit, maybe it's not as relevant, but when you start bulking into energy surplus and also gaining more fat, it might become detrimental for muscle growth.
So just to drill down and make this explicit, we had the lean gains metric where that was positively associated with baseline body fat percentage, and that seemed to be largely driven by changes in fat mass. We also looked at changes in lean mass, and we also looked at changes in direct measures of hypertrophy. And neither of those were significantly associated with baseline body fat percentage. So in other words, it seemed like the subjects in the studies included in our metas with higher body fat percentages were gaining both muscle, so direct measures of hypertrophy, were gaining muscle and lean mass in a calorie deficit at approximately the same rate as leaner people were at energy balance or in a surplus. So a logical implication of that is either that people with higher body fat levels maybe would even gain lean mass and muscle better if they were at a surplus versus an energy deficit, or the implication is that people at higher body fat levels would gain muscle and lean mass as well in a deficit as they would in a surplus or at maintenance. And so, like, if that's the argument you're trying to make, that it's an argument for cutting, I don't see how you square that circle unless you would also assent to the argument that people at higher body fat levels in a deficit gain lean mass and muscle as well as people with higher body fat percentages at maintenance or in a surplus.
Yeah, I know that I'm not actually arguing in favor of the model demonstrating better results at higher body fat levels. I'm rather saying it's not internally consistent and therefore cannot be used to extrapolate to what happens during a bulk.
So on the topic of internal consistency, you mentioned that our meta didn't control the length of studies, didn't control the degree of overfeeding, didn't control for a variety of factors. Can you explain to me how Forbes and Hall accounted for those?
They didn't.
But you use it as evidence.
Yeah, at least to show that there could be something there. So I'm not saying
but ours can't be used to say that there isn't something there?
Yeah, both are weak evidence, I'd say.
But the difference is ours, the people are lifting. And we're measuring muscle.
Yeah. So you have on both sides of the coin, I'd say, weak evidence, one against and one in favor of the hypothesis. So I wouldn't put much stock into either of them, basically.
Mm-hmm. And then on the internal consistency again, you mentioned with obese people that anabolic hormones become an issue and that makes it harder to gain muscle. But you mentioned that in really shredded people, you're not convinced that they struggle to gain muscle, but the effects on anabolic hormones there are like horrendous.
Yeah, I can actually clarify that. I think it's the difference between acute and long-term results. So I think acutely, if you do a 3-month contest prep, it may not be that detrimental. But if you stay in that contest shape long-term and you would try to bulk, I think it would be very detrimental. And I think it's the same with probably body fat percentage and metabolic health effects. Like, especially if you do one bulk up to 25% body fat, and you overall just stay healthy, keep a healthy diet, etc., I don't think you're going to get much acute detrimental effects. But if you stay there very long term, then I think over the long term, we would start seeing a difference in P ratio.
Yeah, and another thing on internal consistency, you mentioned that the studies we were looking at they weren't to study the effect of body fat percentage and how it correlates with hypertrophy. But the studies you use to link inflammation to hypertrophy, most of them just said, hey, we're going to do this intervention and run 1 million correlations and see what sticks. So why are those exploratory correlations meaningful, but ours aren't?
Well, they're equally meaningful in that regard. But an advantage of if you do a study like that would actually be that everything else is equal in the sample. Whereas in your meta-analysis, the problem is that you have so many subcategorizations, like you have to divide it between studies, between groups in the same study, that you're left with within each like homogeneous sample, such a small sample size that there is wide potential for both type 1 and type 2 errors.
Right, but I mean, those studies, I mean, we can't really say that everything else was kept the same. I mean, one of them, we had people admitted to the hospital for totally different medical conditions. None of them controlled for nutrition. None of them controlled for any of the stuff that influences inflammation. And most importantly, none of the high inflammation groups actually had different body fat levels. So they were able to split the groups based on inflammation, and body fat was not a meaningful predictor of that inflammation level in any of those studies. So the idea that we would then say, let's modify body fat as a mechanism of modifying inflammation, in the studies that actually separate people out by inflammation, body fat is a completely meaningless contributor in those studies.
Yeah, and I mean, in practice, I'd probably say that if we can measure all of these things directly in a client, for example, if I could measure them all in a client, I wouldn't use body fat percentage anymore as a proxy. But given that we don't know in practice, I think it makes sense to go by body fat percentage as one of the few metrics we can quantify in some way.
Eric, I kind of have a question. And
Sure.
Menno, if anyone wants to speak up, you can just leave your mic unmuted, so it doesn't just makes it easier to have a free-flowing chat if you want to. Yeah, so like, can you speak to the fact that there seems to be two different questions, right? One question is, can people who have a high body fat percentage gain muscle just as well as people who have a low body fat percentage? And the answer to that, based on your meta-analysis, seems to be yes, even though there's inter-individual variability, right?
Sure.
Yeah. But to me, that seems like at least a slightly different question than saying, me, Jeff, can I gain muscle just as well at 10, 15, 20, and 25%? So it seems like I don't know exactly what your position on this is, but the question is, do you think that I can, right? Like, do you think you can extrapolate that to the individual? And if that's not what you're doing with the meta-analysis, then is it essentially just showing that, well, body fat probably isn't the causative factor that some people seem to think it is when it comes to inhibiting P ratios? So I just want you to comment on like, am I on the right? Like, those feel like two different questions to me. And if you're using the meta-analysis to make the latter claim, how do you make that step?
Yeah, well, I mean, our meta basically answers the question. If I have a high body fat, can I make similar gains compared to, someone at high body fat, someone at low body fat? And, theoretically, at some point, the people with high body fat were people with low body fat. I mean, and if we're saying that all of these negative mechanisms are correlated to body fat, those people that are at a high body fat at the time that these data were collected for the meta-analysis should be subject to this runaway inflammation, this impaired protein balance, these adverse effects on hormone levels. It's difficult to ascertain why they wouldn't suffer those mechanisms because they happen to be there already. Getting to 25%, 30% body fat, it's a verb. It's getting there. They should be subject to those very same mechanisms that are purported to impair hypertrophy, and we didn't see that. And so you are correct, 100% correct, that we cannot necessarily use that to say within an individual it's the exact same relationship. But we do have human data, as I mentioned, on people who are going down to a new body weight and then gaining weight back up toward the previous body weight, and we don't see P ratios improving for them. And so I don't know why we would necessarily assume that it would be the case for people who are lifting. And Mike, you mentioned that or Menno. I'm not in charge. Jeff, you're in charge.
Yeah.
Mike, you want to go first?
Sure. So to a couple of your points, I guess some of these points are from earlier. So I think there's an assumption that can be made that, let's just examine trained lifters, that if you do longitudinal analysis, at some point you're getting fatter and more muscular, P ratios are a certain level. If you do a fat loss phase and get back to a leaner level, you could expect P ratios to improve. But in my view, it's not wise to expect them to improve, because over the course of a lifter's training career, P ratios has predictably just declined the entire time. The apt comparison would be, had they continued to gain at fatter levels, would their P ratios be like compared to them getting leaner and then continuing in the same time course? In those overfeeding studies you talk about, when people didn't have better P ratios when they went down into body weight and then refed back up, I wouldn't expect them to have better P ratios, because I think P ratios over time just degrade. And of course, those studies are on untrained people, but steel manning that, saying, okay, if they were untrained, if we were to look at trained people, I think we would actually have to compare P ratios of continuing to gain versus P ratios of people who sort of re-leaning versus expecting absolutely better P ratios. I think that expectation might not come out, but it might not prove that point. Then I think this has already been said, but at some point, Eric, the way you phrased it is, we're seeing with the study analysis you did with the 7 studies, we're seeing the effect of fat on gains. We don't actually see that effect because there are different individuals. We can't discern the effect exactly of, is it the body fat that is having an effect on P ratios, because there could be a lot of other different things going on. Just to put this in perspective, there is some data that's not entirely convincing, but sort of whets the appetite, that if you put on a considerable amount of body fat, or people with a considerable amount of excess body fat tend to have a faster fiber composition than people who don't have as much body fat, tend to have a slower fiber composition. Probably the biggest reason for this is genetics, and the second or equally big reason for this is the fact that people who are leaner tend to move around more and they have slower fibers, so on and so forth. We also know that people with faster fiber compositions tend to gain muscle mass more robustly than people with slower fiber composition. So just to show that when we look at fatter people and we look at leaner people and we see who can gain muscle better, then that is actually very insightful to whether or not one should gain a lot of fat or not. But it's not completely insightful, and we have to sort of, and I think everyone in this conversation is doing this, but just for viewers who are watching or listening, I think it's important to step back and say, well, there could be some pretty interesting confounders that could potentially eliminate the entire relationship we're concluding from cross-sectional data. It's unlikely that they would eliminate the entire relationship, but I think it could be significantly moderated. Eric, you said earlier that we would suspect that some of those people who were at higher body fat ranges in those studies comparatively, we would assume they were earlier leaner. I'm not sure that is an assumption that is necessarily in order. Some people are born at baby fat body fat percentages, which to say is very high, continue to have high body fat percentages in their entire childhood through the teenage years, enroll in a study at age 22 and still fat. So I don't know if we can say that they were at some point leaner, or that maybe more the opposite of the truth than reality. So just a very, very small technical quibble that I think doesn't attack much of your argument at all, but just important to point out. And then lastly, Greg, to your point on assuming the null hypothesis, I'm not entirely convinced that assuming the null is the best way to think of sort of the philosophy of science and to approach the sort of discernment of reality and otherwise. I think that we should assume nothing and have a very open mind and not just assume the null. So in this case, the null, I believe, is that people with people with different body fat ranges are similarly prone to muscle gain. I think that is actually an assertion of a reality that is just as valid as the assertion of reality that people who are fatter gain worse or gain better or anything else, that they have pink elephants in their homes and they talk to them at night. I think that we can confidently say that, well, we're not really sure about what the relationship is between fat mass and P ratios, just as I think you could equally confidently say I think fat people experience a decline. I don't think the null hypothesis is properly that there is no difference between groups, because the no difference between groups is actually an assertion of a reality that we actually don't have evidence to support at face value. Now, after your analysis, of course, we may actually have some evidence to support that, of course, but I think that the null hypothesis model is I would say severely lacking in how to approach things. I would say the true null hypothesis is no hypothesis at all, is to say I actually don't know, and then the hypotheses of fatter people have better P ratios or worse or neutral is just three alternate hypotheses which should be tested against each other. So it's a real nerdy shit that curious to see what Greg thinks about, but other than that, doesn't really pertain to the technicalities of the discussion much.
Yeah, can I just really quickly comment?
Yeah,
you got it. It'll only be like a minute. I'd say that overall, I think it's like minor detail, but it's not super big. The within/between individuals, there are some reasons to believe that it matters in terms of. We know there are a lot of differences between overweight individuals and people that are naturally gravitate towards being overweight and people that are naturally lean. There are lots of differences. Okay, like psychologically, at a minimum, we have a lot of literature, but probably also in terms of genetic research and everything. So there are actually quite some reasons to believe that these populations differ in some ways. And I think one big one is the propensity to end up in positive versus negative energy balance during a study. So again, if you're not controlling for this, I think that's a big confounder. In any case, I would say that if we had like the Schoenfeld study with 100 subjects rather than the 20 or so that were in it, and your analysis showed the same result, and they were actually overfeeding, then I would, and it had the same result or a negative result in favor of being higher in body fat, that would definitely be cause for me to revise my position. And last technical point, the Forbes study, that was actually, I think, somewhat of an advantage in that I think it more tightly controlled for the overfeeding studies actually being overfeeding studies. It was based on more data, although again it's still weak evidence, and it's not just anorexics. Because
what was the sample size based on more data?
I think so. And it was reanalyzed by Hull without the anorexics, and it held. So it wasn't just the anorexics.
I think it had fewer subjects, not more.
Like in total? I'm also not 100% sure, but
I actually have a question for Menno. So do you agree with the claim that people at a high body fat percentage overall can gain muscle just as well as people at a lower body fat percentage? Like when you look at the data from their meta, do you think that supports that claim? And is it I'll just have you answer that first.
I mean, I'd say their meta overall supports that claim, but it's weak evidence to the extent that I would not say it as, or I would say there is still sufficient cause for concern that it might be detrimental at higher body fat levels.
And if you if you had to bet on it, you would bet that leaner people, to a point, would have a better propensity to build muscle than less lean people. If you had a hunch, if I
had to bet, and we'd have like the perfect study, 100 subjects or the study I just described, for example, and I had to put money on one side or the other, I would put it on the leaner individuals. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Eric, I'm assuming both you and Greg would disagree with that, right? You guys, based on your analysis of the data, seem to think that, despite the fact that there's individual differences, overweight people with a high body fat percentage can build muscle just as well, can make lean gains essentially just as well as people who are leaner. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. I think looking at our data, we see no reason to, again, and it's, whether you want to reframe the null hypothesis or not, we're not necessarily asserting any particular conclusion. We're just saying that people who are definitively saying it is an evidence-based perspective that you should be leaner to gain more muscle, we can't find the evidence for it. So we are not asserting that it is a perfectly false statement that cannot be true. We're saying we looked into it and we can't find any indication of that pattern playing out empirically. And a quick fact check, the Forbes paper had 44 subjects and we had approximately 4 times that many.
So Menno, you basically say, or have said that there's you have the mechanistic rationale for why leaner people might be able to build muscle better. So that is like better anabolic milieu, better insulin sensitivity. The muscle protein balance stuff seems to tilt in the favor of people being leaner, right? You said that's still weak evidence, right? And you said that
the protein balance, I'd say, is like definite cause for concern. But overall, in terms of the actual P ratio debate, and scientifically speaking, this would definitely be weak evidence.
And you think that the meta-analysis from Greg and Eric is also weak evidence. So what tilts your vantage point more in favor of you should cut first? If you think they're both, like, why do you tend to favor the mechanistic stuff? Does it come down to the statistical issues we've already spoke about?
Yeah, because it might be detrimental, and there's like basically no reason at all to think it would be positive to get overweight, to build muscle. So I'd say that, even if we have some like weak reasons to believe it might be detrimental, and I'd say that, we have absolutely no reason to believe it's positive, then it's a reason, given equal personal preference, not to do it.
I suppose the way it would become positive would be if you had someone who, I guess, just wanted to build muscle as much as possible. If you buy into the meta-analysis and you can see that body fat doesn't seem to be correlated with P ratio, then wouldn't that negate the advice that cutting to a lower body fat percentage would be a good idea if your goal was to maximize muscle building, right? If it was all else equal and you had someone saying, I want to go on a bulk and I want to build as much muscle as possible, do you still think that there's good reason to tell them that it would be smart to get a bit leaner first, even if they're, at that higher end of, let's say, 20% body fat or what have you?
I've actually considered that, and my honest answer is I'm really not sure. I really have to think about that, because I've never had a client, for example, a sumo wrestler or or even many defensive linemen, those kind of clients that might actually benefit a lot. You'd have to weigh. It's difficult because we can't quantify the relations, so you have to quantify is it worth spending the time on cutting to potentially potentiate muscle growth in the long run. So that I'd really say I really have to sit down and think about that. I honestly just don't know.
One way that the meta kind of opened my mind, because I think most of us kind of defaulted to what we've heard for a long time. I think even Eric, you and maybe Greg included, this idea that cut first and leaner. There's a bunch of reasons for why you might want to do that, but it kind of opened me up a bit more to the idea that if body fat doesn't really seem to be related to P ratio, then if I'm trying to build more muscle as I approach my genetic limit, then it would make sense for me to bulk to a higher body fat percentage and not, stay leaner just because there may be these various reasons for why my P ratio would be better. So I feel like for me, I might be a typical clientele of, Eric or Menno. Say I'm 12% body fat now and I do want to build more muscle. Maybe I'm not at my genetic limit. As I get to that 15% range, Menno might say, well, it'd be a good idea to run a cut and get leaner again because you'll potentiate your gains. You seem to be not so sure on that point, but it doesn't sound like bad advice to you. Whereas Eric might say that it would be better to push it up, maybe go 15% and 16%, and that shouldn't impede your ability to gain muscle regardless. I don't know exactly where I stand on that, but I feel like that is a practical example where this actually would have an outcome that would matter for people who are listening,
Yeah, I mean, just to toss one data point out there, and, we can't necessarily assume that this is causative, but when we look at research on the humans who, either are drug-free or who we presume to be drug-free, that have the most muscle mass, the most fat-free mass, they don't tend to be particularly lean, but they also don't tend to be extremely fat. So most of them seem to be somewhere between 20 to 35% body fat, and for the most part between like 25 and 30% body fat. So you don't see that many people in like the 45 to 50% body fat range, and you also don't see many people at all who are sub 20. And I'm not saying that that is insanely informative, but I don't think that we should completely discount it. One other thing that I think the last thing I want to say about the difference between correlations between individuals starting at different body fat percentages versus the relationship between body fat and P ratios within a single individual is, I think, one of the things that perhaps would strengthen the case made in our meta-analysis is one of the things we know is that individuals have varying inherent P ratios, or there are obviously like a lot of things that would influence P ratios, but basically people with higher body fat levels have tended to gain more fat in overfeeding, and that's one of the things contributing to the fact that they have higher levels of body fat. So the fact that we were seeing better lean gains and similar absolute hypertrophy in a slight energy deficit in the people with higher body fats in our meta-analysis, I think is strengthened further by that. Because if you were using an informed prior, if you were saying like, based on what we know about individuals who are naturally leaner versus naturally have higher body fats, what would we expect to see? And I think you would expect to see worse lean gains in people with higher body fats, because one of the things contributing to the fact that they had higher body fats in the first place is that they probably just genetically had worse P ratios in their life up to that point. Anyway, that's not directly relevant to where you were trying to guide the discussion, but I wanted to get that last little thing in there before we completely moved on from the difference of like between individuals versus within individuals. So like someone like you who at least seems to be a naturally leaner person, if anything, I would think that your P ratio, if your body fat got higher, would be less negatively impacted by having high body fat than someone who just naturally has high body fat, because there's someone who naturally has a worse P ratio, and that's how they got fat to begin with.
Fair. I guess like, to me, kind of like putting this together, I guess like it does seem like there's quite a bit of agreement in terms of like on an individual level. I think it could be more so a matter of like clientele and the goals that like you guys are respectively dealing with, like Menno just said, he's never had a strength athlete who just wants to maximize muscle and strength at all cost. And so the people you're dealing with, it seems to just be more rational advice to put them in the direction that they're probably wanting to go anyway. And then apart from that, it seems like, I guess, Eric and Greg seem to be more in favor of the null hypothesis, which is to say like body fat percentage and P ratio are not correlated based on the meta, whereas Menno doesn't think that the meta is, I guess, relevant enough to use that as evidence for that position. So I don't really know, where we go from go from here at this point, because without new data, it's just kind of us having our own opinions about it, really, unless there's something else that I'm missing.
Yeah, I would like to add one thing if I could. Sorry, Menno, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I do think one thing that's important is we clearly have different perspectives in terms of like what is the safe approach. Like if we don't know for sure what is the safe approach when guiding a client. And I think that's really telling about what you're getting at, Jeff, is the fact that, Menno has mentioned that most of his clients tend to be on the leaner side of the spectrum, or their goal is to be on the leaner side of the spectrum, more physique focused. And so managing body fat is a critically important part of that. As Mike alluded to, talking about physique athletes, there are real practical non-P ratio consequences associated with getting up to 25, 30% body fat and beyond. Getting back down to stage shape after that is going to be a hell of a time. There might be extra skin, things like that. And so I think it's really telling, like, so Greg and I, we interact a lot with people who, I mean, the site's called Stronger by Science, you know, it's not Leaner by Science. So they're like, I want to bench as much as I can before I die. And so when you have that person talking to you, it's like, well, why don't we cut? And so for us, the safest thing is, like, if we're really focused on maximizing lean tissue, maximizing strength, and we're not worried about, you know, aesthetic appearance, physique performance, we're really talking about strength and muscle. To us, the safest thing says, well, I mean, let's stay in an energy surplus, or at least, you know, close to energy balance, rather than going into a big deficit. Because for us, the safest thing is, let's do the things that contribute to muscle growth and getting bigger and stronger. Let's make sure we're eating enough and continue building from there. So I think that difference in perspective is pretty big. Whereas if we assume that every client coming to us eventually wants to end up on stage, or, you know, with like a fitness model type physique, then our safest option might become, let's not get too far away from our goal long-term body fat percentage. And so in that case, I think, based on, you know, we can have this academic back and forth and kind of quibble over the details. And I do want to be very clear that I have a great deal of respect and admiration for Mike and Menno. I think both you guys do tremendous work. And I think, based on your clientele, your safest bet in the face of uncertainty might be different than the safest bet with some of the clients that Greg and I work with, which is, if we don't have a damn good reason to cut and go into a deficit and take everything that comes with it, maybe we don't, you know?
I think that's good. I have one quick question for Menno, and then I can let you guys have your say and we can wrap it up, because I know we're coming in on 2 hours, and yeah. So, like, when
I had a specific request for a 3-hour podcast on Reddit, so we're just getting started.
Did you actually, though?
Yeah, no, 100%. Someone on the Stronger by Science subreddit said, I expect a 3-hour podcast about this.
They seem to always do that. Your audience is cool like that. Like, you don't need to rush.
Dude, I've just been grandstanding because I'm trying to give the people what they want. I don't know what to tell you.
Fair enough.
Greg initially mentioned that he was free till 5 before we started recording, and I laughed, but I'm not laughing anymore. That was relevant information.
So like, for me, before the Mass article came out and then the follow-up pieces, like, I was under the impression that my, you know, lean gains would be, in pretty much across the board, you know, lean gains would be inhibited the higher body fat percentage you get. And my mind was kind of changed on that since reading it. Like, I feel like the relationship there isn't as strong as I would have thought it was, even though I'm still kind of undecided on some of the practical questions. I'm curious, like, Menno, has your stance softened at all as a result of any of that? Or do you still feel more or less exactly the same? Like, do you think that maybe you would push that percentage higher in certain people who have certain goals? Or do you still kind of lean on the same understanding you had before?
It's changed a little, yeah. I think the most objective measure for me always, my stance on the topic, is how my PT course materials update. And they've updated, and the range is slightly increased. So I did that objectively. My stance has slightly differed, and I was actually about to make a much bigger update to my course materials based on the Schoenfeld study, or their analysis of the Schoenfeld study, until I saw it was actually an energy deficit study rather than their intended bulking study. So yeah, I'd say overall, I've definitely erred more on the side of emphasizing the limitations of extrapolating from theoretical mechanisms. No.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I just want to say anything to remain relevant. Any recommendations? JK, so just one thing that I think may be cool for folks to know. I think one of the biggest upsides of doing a fat loss phase is to give yourself what I would term runway for further gains until you get to a level of fat that would just say you just don't like to be. So someone could say, okay, I'm at 18% fat and I could keep gaining, but I just don't really want to be like 22% fat and have to explain to people with hand gestures that I lift weights instead of them clearly being able to see such a thing on my body. And the cool thing about fat loss, especially for well-trained individuals, this applies to drug-free folks for sure, is that you can lose fat relatively rapidly with almost no gains in lean mass at the time, and certainly no long-term gains in lean mass that you can't rebound right back and get again. And what you can do is, let's say you're at 18% fat, it's actually not that difficult for many people, not all, but many, to get down to something like 13% fat in a relatively short period of time. I would say probably about 10 weeks. And because I think probably all of us on here think that, gaining should occur relatively slowly, not as fast as fat loss, what you do is you get down to 13% and you have opened up months of future gains where you don't have to risk getting above the 20s and doing this stuff. So I think probably the biggest benefit, P ratio debate aside, of why cutting to potentiate further massing is a good idea is because there's a level of fat you just don't want to get to, and everyone has that level. Most people have that level of fat, and by cutting occasionally, which doesn't have a ton of downsides, you can just give yourself a shitload of more runway to get great long-term super momentum mass gains. Whereas, if you get to 20% and you say, I don't want to get any further than this, I'm just going to recomp from here, I think it's pretty clear that intentional tissue gain works better for long-term muscle gain than continuous recomping, which, if you're especially advanced, leads to just jack shit after a while, or just very small amounts. So I think that runway thing is why I do occasional fat loss phases, even if I don't have plans of stepping on stage anytime soon. So it's something that neat, maybe. Am I relevant yet?
That's good. One thing that this will be the last thing I bring up is, I think you, Eric, and Greg seem to want to dismiss the anabolic hormones mechanism and the inflammation mechanism insofar as they don't seem to be strongly linked to either body fat or hypertrophy within normal ranges.
There are associations between all three.
Yeah.
It's just a question of the strength of the associations and what the slopes of them would be. So they're relatively weak associations, and they don't seem to have super notable impact. So you can't necessarily say hey, if my CRP levels go up 2 units, the rate at which I gain muscle will go down by 1 kilo per 3 months, and there's a tight confidence interval on that. It's not that those things aren't associated. It's just that, as far as I can tell, it has really, really poor predictive value.
Yeah. I haven't heard a whole lot of talk about just how being near one's genetic natural potential, muscular potential, might impact this. Could it be possible that the reason we seem to think that this period, and the reason people are kind of looking for that needle in the haystack, I think as you described it, Eric, is that as we get more advanced and get more interested in these topics, we just get closer to our natural potential to build muscle. And so then any increase in body weight almost necessarily results in more fat gain than muscle gain. To me, that seems to be a pretty relevant factor. And I just am curious, Eric and Menno, what you think of that correlation as it seems like it would matter.
I mean, I think it's a plausible kind of line of thinking. It's tricky because, we look at all these different indirect kind of scenarios and indirect pieces of evidence and say, well, okay, what could this be telling us about P ratio? And it's hard to look at any of those without building in some assumptions. You know what I mean? But I mean, certainly if you viewed someone's lifting journey as essentially a linear path through time, and the goal is to maximize their muscle, at any cost, and they continue overfeeding to do so, then yes, you would imagine that as they continue to get closer to their genetic limit, of course, we would expect that the rate of gains in terms of lean mass will probably start to taper off at some point. But then if they continue the same magnitude of overfeeding, then that could kind of reveal itself as an impaired P ratio. So I think the line of inquiry, if we set those assumptions, is valid, but it also leans on some pretty big assumptions. And, I think for most people, we don't view our lifting career as that singular kind of linear path. And, there's a lot of, bulk and then cut back and bulk and then cut back for a lot of people. And I think one of the things I liked that Mike said was, there's a level of fat that you don't want to get to, like the general you. And I think for a lot of people, that's the case. But one of the things that I want to really emphasize with our analysis, our perspective of the data, the interpretation of our meta-analysis is I think we are empowering people to really have a lot more flexibility with where they set that number. So, the maximal level of fat that Mike is comfortable with might be different than what Menno's comfortable with, which might be different than what I'm comfortable with. So what we wanted to really empower people with is the observation that we can't seem to find a body fat within these ranges where you can really reliably say these folks are much worse off in terms of hypertrophy because they've gotten to this particular body fat. And so we think it's a really encouraging and empowering kind of finding because it puts a little bit more autonomy back into the hands of the client so that we don't have to say you are going to be uncomfortable or you're going to be unhappy at X% body fat. It's more of a conversation for practical reasons. What is the level that you are where you start becoming uncomfortable with your fat gain? And I think we've loosened up that range a little bit, which I think should generally be perceived as a pretty positive thing, at least based on our interpretation of the data.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think personal preferences, that's literally my method, actually. Basically a decision tree, generally, as if a client ever asks, should I cut or should I bulk? Should I keep bulking? It's always, well, one, are you happy with your body fat percentage? And that's basically the cutoff question right there. If there's a decisive answer to that, only if they say like, I don't know, maybe do what's just long-term best, then I err towards not getting too high in body fat level.
All right. Well, I'm good to call it here, unless you guys wanted to have any other kind of concluding remarks or anything like that. You guys can all flick on your mics now if you want.
Yeah, I think my concluding remark is I don't necessarily know that we differ all that much when it comes to for recommendations for practical application. I think my perspective is just that when someone asks, like, should I bulk or should I cut, or you're having that conversation with a client, I think that you should ideally frame that discussion in terms of client preferences and also things that are well known and well established. So the client preference is obviously probably the most important one. If you're talking with an athlete who's, say, like a sprinter, and they're like, should I get up to 25% body fat? It's like, well, watch the Olympic finals. Do any of them look like they're 25% body fat? Probably not. So, you can have conversations with people in the context of their sports, in the context of their goals related to long-term health, all of these things. And there's generally good evidence you can make recourse to about the positive versus negative effects of being in a deficit or surplus for client preferences, various goals, etc. My perspective is just that we don't have solid evidence to say that necessarily making recourse to, well, if you get to too high of a body fat percentage, your hypertrophy will be worse. So, since we don't have solid evidence establishing that, when I'm having that conversation with a client or when I'm, putting information out into the world about reasons that someone might want to bulk or cut, that's not something that's going to go on my list of things that I talk about with the client or considerations that I put out there in articles or content, just because I haven't seen sufficient evidence that that is in fact the case.
Yeah, I'd also say, I think that's a big thing to keep in mind as perspective on the debate I had with you guys, Greg and Eric. in general, that I will debate very differently if we're talking about practical applications for clients, which is generally my default stance, versus offering a scientific review. Like if you read my scientific review on rest intervals, or if you're going to read upcoming study on diet break study that I co-authored, you're going to get a much more neutral impression from me than if you ask me like client recommendation, which I will say with much more confidence in terms of practical advice, etc. So that's a very big difference of mindset, what you tell someone on what to do versus whether you're asking someone of what the state of nature is and how certain scientifically can we be about that.
All right. Eric, you have anything else? Are we good?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I would just close by saying I think, first of all, I really appreciate you, Jeff, for putting this together, and everybody for being willing to just come and share ideas and be, open and stuff, and open to ideas and sharing perspectives and things. I think it's really beneficial and really informative. And I think while we, Menno and I specifically, I think we disagree on a lot of the finer points of some of the research, but that's okay. That doesn't mean, I still very much respect his opinion. I think he does a great job at what he does. So I really appreciate everybody coming here to share ideas. And even though many of us disagree on some of the finer points of the research, I think what's really valuable is that we've kind of keyed in on some of the most important practical takeaways. So if you're someone who is in the middle of a bulk and you think you might be getting toward the end of it, I think you're more informed about what factors should be dictating your decision. Do I cut or do I keep bulking? If you're a personal trainer who works with somebody who comes to you brand new and they say, my long-term goal is to be both more muscular and leaner, you have more information about how to have that conversation of, okay, what do we do first and why do we do that first?
Awesome. Mike, unless you had anything else, we can wrap it up.
Jeff, I need money. As you know, I have a very well curated Lamborghini collection, but there are never enough. Give me some of your YouTube followers. God damn it. Do I have to just spell it out?
Well, I'll go ahead and link it down below. It's up to them if they follow.
Thank you so much for hosting. As always, you're an excellent moderator. So thanks so much. And to the rest of you guys, it's always an honor to share a chat room with you. That comes off weird and in late 1990s pervert sort of way, so I'll just shut the fuck up.
No, I thought it was good. And
I agree that it's always an honor to share a chat room with me, Mike, and I appreciate you for acknowledging it.
All right. Yeah, I comment that in terms of, I have a lot of respect for all of you guys except Mike. My relationship with Mike is purely sexual, so not so much.
Isn't sex based on respect? I learned in middle school that before you have sex, respect is a must. So I don't know what they teach you folks in the Netherlands, which are soon to be acquired by Eric and Greg anyway. Giant.
That's because you're the sub and I'm the dom. So,
oof, daddy.
Yeah, so just to get this back on topic. No, I just want to echo everyone else. I think this has been a really good and productive conversation. Jeff, as always, you were a fantastic host, and I have greatly enjoyed this discussion with you guys, Mike and Menno.
Yeah, likewise. It was good. I felt like it was productive as well, so I appreciate it. If anyone's still listening, I'll have everybody's stuff linked down below. And thanks everyone for coming on. I really do appreciate it. We'll leave it there.